Okay. Capital structure is the percent of debt and equity used to fund the firm's assets. Leverage is the use of debt in the capital structure. Capital restructuring is changing the amount of leverage without changing the firm's assets. So you could issue debt and repurchase outstanding shares, or you could decrease leverage by issuing new shares and retiring outstanding debt. The primary goal of financial managers is to maximize stockholder wealth. Maximizing stockholder wealth is maximizing the firm's value and minimizing the WACC. The objective is to choose the capital structure that will minimize the WACC and maximize their stockholder wealth. The effect of financial leverage. Financial leverage is equal to the use of debt. Leverage amplifies the variation in both earnings per share and return on equity because you can do more good projects with more if you use more debt, but you can also have more problems. So we will ignore the effect of taxes at this stage. What happens to the earnings per share?
Leverage amplifies the variation of both earnings per share, of course, because there's more debt,
right,
and return on equity because there is more debt.
There's more debt.
And also, and also there's more shares. There's more shares.
No, because
if you've made $10 and you have 5 shares, that is $2 per share.
Right.
I mean, I'm just saying it's so vague. But if you issued more shares and you have $10 to be distributed with 10 shares, so it will.
No. We're not talking about shares here because that's equity. We're talking about debt. So, like, if you borrowed $10 to make $10 more, then you would have $20 split between 5 shares.
Yep. Sweet, I got you.
Okay. What happens to the earnings per share when we issue debt and buy back shares of stock? So, if we buy back shares, that means there's less equity, and if we issue debt, we would hopefully have more. Hopefully have more earnings. So EPS and ROE would rise, I believe. Bankruptcy costs. There are direct costs and there are indirect costs. As far as direct
costs are everything involved in declaring bankruptcy.
Right, such as legal and administrative costs. Bondholders incur additional losses, and it's a disincentive to debt financing. Financial distress. If a company has significant problems meeting the debt obligations, they may go into financial distress, but most firms that experience financial distress do not ultimately file for bankruptcy. Indirect bankruptcy costs. They are larger than direct costs, but are more difficult to measure and estimate. Stockholders wish to avoid a formal bankruptcy, and bondholders wish to keep existing assets intact so they can at least receive that money. The assets lose value as management spends time worrying about avoiding bankruptcy instead of running a business, and so indirect bankruptcy costs include things like lost sales, interrupted operations, loss of valuable employees, low morale, inability to purchase goods on credit. No problems from Chapter 14. Dividend payment chronology. Declaration date is when the board declares the dividend and becomes a liability of the firm. The ex-dividend date occurs 2 business days before the...
So one more time. Declaration date is the date that the board declares a dividend.
Right. We are going to pay a dividend.
And the ex-dividend date occurs 2 days before the date of record. So this is the date this is how it progresses. The declaration date is first, the ex-dividend date is second, the date of record, and then it's payment. Okay, so the date of record 2 days before you buy a stock, before after this date. Okay, sweet. So if you buy say today is the ex-dividend date and you buy a stock, you buy a share right now, you're not getting nothing from the dividend. The date of record, holders of record.
The date of record is the official day when the holders are determined and will receive the dividend payment.
Yep.
But the ex-dividend date is the actual cutoff date.
Okay, so it's declaration, date of record. Declaration, ex-dividend, date of record, payment.
Right. Declaration, ex-dividend, date of record, date of payment.
Declaration, ex-dividend, date of record, date of payment.
Yeah, man.
Bada boom, bada bing.
And the ex-dividend date?
That occurs 2 days before the date of record.
And
what?
And if you
If you buy stock, then you're shit out of luck. I'm shit out of luck. What am I without you?
Stock repurchase is when the company buys back shares of its own stock. If it buys it in the open market, then it's just paying the regular price. It can buy it as a tender offer, and the company can state a purchase price often higher than a regular price to try to drive up the price of the stock. Or they can issue a targeted repurchase where they can purchase shares from specific holders, say, for example, if they wanted to take power away from a certain person. Repurchase versus a cash dividend. A repurchase of stock returns cash from the firm to the stockholders. It is if there were no taxes and transactions costs. Repurchasing stock would have the same effect on total shareholder wealth as a cash dividend. Because if, say, so the company has 100,000 shares of stock, they buy back 20,000. That means there are only 80,000 left, so the price of those 80,000 will rise.
Yep.
Pros and cons of paying dividends. Pros. Cash dividends underscore good results and provide quick support to the stock price. Dividends may attract institutional investors, which cannot get rid of the principal.
So hang on a second. Just right on this. This company, James and Neil Inc., has 1,000 shares.
Already?
Yeah. What is the money allocated for these shares called before it's paid?
What? I'm not sure what you mean.
The amount of money. Okay, we pay this out of our retained earnings, right?
For the dividends?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So what's that money to be paid for dividends called?
I think it would be just retained earnings, wouldn't it?
But how do you decide? Okay, if we say we're going to pay $5 per share out of retained earnings, is there a specific name for that or no?
Not as far as I know. I'm sure there is, but
okay, fine.
I don't know.
So why would it drive the price per share up? Hypothetically, if we're $5 per share, and there was 5,000.
Because remember, it's the price of the stock is the present value of the future cash flows. So if we expect to get a certain amount of a dividend, you can discount that back to today and find the price of the stock. So if the amount of the dividend is increased, then that means the stock price will increase.
The amount of the dividends is increased.
Right.
You mean the amount of dividends is decreased? Sorry. You're right. So say hypothetically you bought back 200 shares.
Correct.
So there's 800 shares left.
Mm-hmm.
How would that make it be worth $6 a share?
Just because there are fewer in the market, so they'd be in higher demand.
One would assume, based on the forces of supply and demand, but is that actually true? Does that happen?
Well, there may be other forces that act on it, but this is all in theory, so.
Okay, fine.
It works in theory, but doesn't work in practice.
Because communism is great in theory.
Exactly.
Communism is great on paper. If I had a country, it would be communist. 100%, I'd be bloody better, but let's go back to this.
Okay. Pros of paying dividends is what we're on. Stock price usually increases with a new or increased dividend. Dividends absorb excess cash and may reduce agency costs. So what this is saying is, if there's less, if the company has a bunch of money and they pay it out to the stockholders, then the stockholders don't have to spend as much time monitoring the management of the company to make sure that they're not wasting those funds.
Sweet.
Cons of paying dividends. Dividends are taxed to recipients. Dividends can reduce internal sources of funding. And so, for example, let's say they've just paid out a massive dividend, but then they could have used that money to reinvest and make even more money. And so maybe they have to borrow money to do that project. And so they'll make less money in the long run. Once established...
I don't like borrowing money.
Well, there is something to be said for financial leverage, but...
It's all about retained earnings, baby, because you don't owe nobody nothing, and you don't give up control of your business.
That's true.
Boom.
Bada boom, bada bing.
Bada boom, bada bing.
Okay. Once established, dividend cuts are hard to make without adversely affecting a stock's price.
Stock dividends distribute additional shares of stock instead of cash. It increases the number of outstanding shares. A small stock dividend is less than 20 to 25%. If you own 100 shares of a company and it declared a 10% stock dividend, you would receive an additional 10 shares. A large stock dividend is more than 20 to 25%. A stock split is essentially the same as a stock dividend except expressed as a ratio. For example, a 2-for-1 stock split is the same as a 100% stock dividend. Stock price is reduced when the stock splits. Common explanation is to reduce the price to a more desirable trading range. A reverse split reduces the number of shares outstanding. For example, a 1-for-5 stock split replaces every 5 shares of stock with 1 share. Reasons: transactions costs may be less for investors, liquidity might be improved, and too low a price might not be considered respectable, and there are also minimum price per share requirements on the stock exchange.
So it's like $5 a share.